This video explains the diplomatic rules in the World Crisis, GMT's World War I Grand Strategy game. To avoid missing any future videos on this channel, be sure to subscribe. This video is based on the World Crisis components, rules, and other materials available as of the date of this video's release, August 2025. These components, rules, and other materials may change as a result of playtesting, and the published version of the game may vary from what is discussed in this video. In August 1914, World War I was not yet a world war. Turkey and Italy remained on the sidelines, while Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece considered their positions. Norway and Sweden remained neutral, as did the United States. Within a few years, most European countries had joined one side or the other, with only the Netherlands, Switzerland, Spain, and the Scandinavian countries remaining neutral. In April 1917, the United States entered the war, and what became known as the Great War could truly be considered a world war. Incidentally, the German zoologist, naturalist, eugenicist, philosopher, physician, professor, marine biologist, and artist, Ernst Heinrich Philipp August Haeckel, was the first person to use the term First World War in September 1914. From the design standpoint, the challenge was to create a dynamic diplomatic system which allowed for neutral countries to enter the war earlier or later, and on different sides, than they did historically. The players had to have something to say about this, but the diplomatic system also couldn't be completely under their control. Since the economic system in the world crisis is based on activity counters, it was only natural to base the diplomatic system on the diplomatic systems in Gathering Storm and Storm over Asia, but with some important differences, as we shall see. The diplomatic phase in the world crisis takes place once the economic phase is completed. If you need a refresher on the sequence of play, go through the introductory video Making World War I Fun Again, and especially the video on the sequence of play. The World Crisis diplomatic rules begin with an overview, Rule 14.1. I won't go through this, we'll be looking at the diplomatic rules in detail. Rule 14.2 lists the 8 diplomatic targets in the game, the inherent modifiers, if any, that may apply to each diplomatic target, and the starting flags, if any, in each diplomatic target. Italy is a neutral major power which begins with a pro-Allied inherent modifier of -1 and no flags. Turkey is a neutral major power which begins with a pro-Central Powers inherent modifier of +1 and 1 German flag. This inherent modifier is contingent on the German battlecruiser Goeben starting the game in Constantinople. If the Goeben remains with the German High Seas Fleet, there is no inherent modifier for Turkey. The United States is a neutral major power with no starting flags. The inherent modifiers for the United States depend on whether one side or the other has declared war on the Low Countries, and also on the British and French cohesion levels. For the Balkan minor countries, Bulgaria begins with a pro-Central Powers inherent modifier of +1 and 1 German flag. Romania begins with a pro-Allied inherent modifier of -1 and 1 French flag. Greece begins with no inherent modifier and no flag. The Scandinavian minor countries, Norway and Sweden, begin with no inherent modifiers and no flags. Activity counters used for diplomacy are termed diplomatic counters. The normal limit on the use of diplomatic counters each turn for each major power is 2 generic counters plus 1 flexible activity counter. Activity counters that have already been used for things like research and industry may not be used for diplomacy. Rule 14.4 sets out the mechanics of diplomacy and the restrictions on diplomatic counter placement. Diplomatic counters are placed face down during the diplomatic phase. Each side may place only one diplomatic counter in each diplomatic target. This restriction also applies to flexible activity counters. As previously mentioned, each major power may use two generic counters, plus its flexible activity counter, for diplomacy. There are two exceptions to this. An active German or British spy ring in a diplomatic target allows the placement of a diplomatic counter beyond the normal limit. German random event 92 and British random event 65 allow the use of an additional diplomatic counter. The sequence for placing diplomatic counters is set out in Rule 14.42. All additional Central Powers diplomatic counters are placed during the initial round. The diplomatic effects of active spy rings, which in part depends on whether they are eliminated, are set out in Rule 14.43. Rule 14.44 sets out the additional restrictions on diplomacy. The target must be neutral. Each side may only place one diplomatic counter in each target. This restriction is repeated for emphasis. Zero activity counters may be used to bluff. We now come to the most important part of diplomacy. The diplomatic efforts of the two sides are compared. If the diplomatic efforts are equal, there is no change. If one side's diplomatic effort is greater than the other's, the diplomatic advantage in the target shifts in favor of that side. Then a die roll is made to see if the diplomatic advantage in the target is converted to one or more diplomatic results. It is very important to remember that a diplomatic advantage is not the same thing as a diplomatic result. The diplomatic effort for each side for each diplomatic target is the total of the diplomatic counters placed in the target, any diplomatic random events applying to the target, any modifier from active spy rings or covert operations, and the inherent modifier for the target. The difference in diplomatic efforts determines the shift in the diplomatic advantage in the target. In contrast to Gathering Storm, there is no limit to the size of diplomatic advantage that may be obtained in a single turn. Diplomatic advantages are cumulative, so one side or the other will often have a diplomatic advantage in a target from the previous turn. Diplomatic advantages are tracked on the diplomatic tracking play. If either side has a diplomatic advantage in a target, regardless of which side had the greater diplomatic effort in the target in the current turn, it makes a diplomatic die roll for the target to try to convert its diplomatic advantage into one or more diplomatic results. A special limitation applies to the United States. There is a limit on the size of the diplomatic advantage that may be obtained in the United States. This limit increases with each passing year. These limits are indicated in the American section of the diplomatic tracking play. One die is rolled for every diplomatic target in which one side or the other has a diplomatic advantage. A diplomatic die roll that is greater than the diplomatic advantage has no effect. A diplomatic die roll that is equal to the diplomatic advantage converts one diplomatic advantage into a diplomatic result. A diplomatic die roll that is one less than the diplomatic advantage converts two diplomatic advantages into two diplomatic results. A diplomatic die roll that is two less than the diplomatic advantage converts three diplomatic advantages into three diplomatic results, and so on. When diplomatic results are achieved, flags are removed from the diplomatic advantage row of the diplomatic tracking play, and either a friendly flag is added or an enemy flag is removed from the diplomatic results row. Rule 14.55 explains the mechanics of how diplomatic results are implemented. 5 flags in a major power causes that major power to enter the war on the side of the alliance achieving that result. The only exception to this is that the US won't go to war with the Allies, but 5 Central Powers flags in the US breaks the British blockade. For the 3 Balkan minor countries, 3 flags gives hex control. 5 flags causes that Balkan minor country to enter the war on the side of the alliance achieving that result. Norway and Sweden are always neutral, but 5 flags yield a trade pact, which increases the cohesion level of the successful major power. There are 3 ways that diplomatic results can occur, adding or removing a flag, apart from normal diplomacy. While diplomatic random events usually modify the drawing major power's diplomatic effort in a target, there are some random events that trigger a diplomatic result, apart from any normal diplomatic results. Random events for neutral major powers always trigger a diplomatic result. Finally, each turn of German unrestricted submarine warfare triggers a pro-Allied diplomatic result in the United States. Here are some examples of how all this works. We will use Greece because it doesn't have an inherent modifier. Let's assume that diplomacy in previous turns has given France 2 diplomatic results and has left Britain with a diplomatic advantage of 1. Britain's diplomatic effort in the current turn is 3 greater than that of the Central Powers, increasing Britain's diplomatic advantage to 4. A diplomatic die roll of 5 or 6 would fail. There would be no diplomatic results, and the Allies would retain their diplomatic advantage for the next turn. A diplomatic die roll of 4 would transfer 1 British flag from the diplomatic advantage row to the diplomatic results row. A diplomatic die roll of 3 would transfer 2 British flags. A diplomatic die roll of 2 would transfer 3 British flags. A diplomatic die roll of 1 would have the same effect as a diplomatic die roll of 2, because the maximum diplomatic result is 5. If Britain had started with a diplomatic advantage of 4, then increased this to 6, it would be guaranteed to get at least 1 diplomatic result, even on a diplomatic die roll of 6. That is why the diplomatic advantage row has only 5 cells. At the end of the diplomatic phase, neither side can ever have a diplomatic advantage greater than 5. Players familiar with Gathering Storm and Storm over Asia will recognize many features of the World Crisis diplomatic rules, but at the same time will appreciate that diplomacy in the World Crisis is much more volatile than it is in those games, as the diplomatic alignment of neutral countries can change radically in a single turn.